Hello and welcome to the second chapter of the Model Kits for Beginners learning course, where I teach you how to build and paint a scale model kit with an airbrush. In this chapter, we're going to be building the airframe, focusing on assembling the parts precisely and looking at the different techniques we can use to achieve that.
Here's what we have so far: the cockpit tub and two fuselage halves. We finished the previous chapter at step 13, and now we're going to start assembling the airframe. You can skip part of step 15 if you're having the canopy open, which we are, however you'll still need to trim part of the tail. For that it says see step 27, so let's have a look. The instructions are showing you that to fit the rudder you need to trim the upper part of the tail. This is due to the kit allowing multiple aircraft variants with different size rudders. You see this a lot, and although frustrating in some cases, it's also very useful for modelers. Step 16 also shows you that you need to cut the door off to have it open. I won't be doing this, but if you want to, just use the following technique. To trim the tail you can use many tools, but looking closer at it we can see that we're cutting along a panel line. This will act as a jig for us to cut from, so I can use a simple scalpel to slice off the plastic. Run it along multiple times at a medium pressure until it comes off. You could also use a saw or any blade that you have, as long as you're careful and precise. Once the piece is off, you can gently sand or scrape the edge to make it smooth and flat. Once that's done, we can start to close the fuselage. First, we'll test fit the tub, checking where it fits and what connections we need to make in order to get the alignment right. The rear bulkhead fits into a notch in the fuselage, and so does the front. Now add the other half and look for any gaps or misalignments in the fuselage. This will show you where you might need to sand or trim the cockpit tub. Any issues here could be caused by you, the builder, or the kit itself, so it's important to take care when building and make sure we try and fit things as they should. Then if you have any issues fitting the sub-assemblies together, you can rest easy knowing it's most likely the kit rather than your handiwork. If you're getting gaps in the fuselage half around the cockpit, then you need to sand down the outside of the tub, trying to pinpoint the issued area. Be patient and work methodically until you find the issue. Effort here is well worth it, as a good fit at this stage will save you a lot of work later on. You can also test fit the fuselage halves without the cockpit tub to see how they fit, to further identify the issue. Fit issues cause ripple effects throughout the kit, so you really want to deal with them early on. To glue the parts, we're going to use Tamiya cement in white as we're joining the parts together. Then we'll come in after and fuse the parts with Tamiya extra thin. I'll apply the cement to the locating pins on the fuselage, and for the tub I'll apply a thin layer to the side walls. Before gluing, make sure the surface is flat and free of paint. A small dusting of overspray isn't an issue. Try to apply a moderate amount of cement. It doesn't compress well, so if you apply large blobs it'll shift the part by a fraction, but enough to affect the fit. A light but broad application is what we're looking for. As we did when assembling the cockpit, we can use the other half as a jig whilst one side is being glued. Pushing from underneath will keep the tub in position and apply some pressure to the gluing areas, helping the connection. After a few minutes you can remove the dry half and leave the assembly to cure. Now for the two fuselage halves. In this kit we only have the cockpit tub as an internal assembly. In other kits you may have parts for the engine, propeller, tail wheel or avionics. But luckily for you guys I did my homework and I picked a nice kit for beginners with only one thing to worry about. Before we glue these parts together we need to make sure we've done a dry fit test, cleaned up the seams and removed any excess sprue, and added everything that we need to on the inside. Now is the time to sort any gaps, so multiple fit tests will help with this. If you're having a random gap in the fuselage seam, it might be due to excess sprue still leaving a slight protrusion and pushing the part away, causing a gap. Use a firm sanding sponge or a file to flatten the seams. As far as holding the part when we glue it, because it's quite big we can't just slap the glue on and hold it together with our hands. You could, but the result would be somewhat wonky. So instead I'm going to use an assortment of clamps and holding devices. These black handled clamps I bought for super cheap at a car boot sale, and they're perfect. Enough pressure to hold firm but not enough to crush the plastic, and they come in different sizes and tensions. I use these mostly on flat areas like the wings or the vertical stabilizers, but you can experiment. This yellow tipped finger clamp is from the Humbrol tool set, and I've had it for nearly a decade and I've never needed more than one. This is useful for its rubber tips, which can grip and flex around curved parts and act like your fingers holding it. You can also use elastic bands or simply tape the parts together. If you have lots of patience, you can join the halves slowly in stages using extra thin and quickset. Hold the area with your fingers and then use extra thin quickset to glue that small area, then work your way around the entire airframe. I'm going to join the halves in stages using different techniques for each, starting with Tamiya cement at the nose. If you only have plastic cement, you can use the following technique for the entire assembly. Apply a small amount to the pins and to the edge. And then slowly line up the halves, making sure all the pins go in the right place. Once the halves are together, apply some moderate pressure. The glue takes a few minutes to dry, so you can manipulate the parts until it aligns properly. Now you can place the finger clamps around the halves and adjust them to add pressure. Now leave it for 10 to 15 minutes to allow the glue to dry before removing the clamps. Whilst it's drying, it's important to go back over it and check that it's all in the right place. When you're done, you can move on to the tail. For this, I'm going to use extra thin and quickset. I'll clamp the parts in place, then once they're aligned properly, checking for ridges and gaps, we can apply the extra thin to the joint and the capillary action will spread the glue around it. It only works if the parts are touching. This is an important process, so we need to take our time and not cause any issues by rushing. Again, leaving it to dry for 10 to 15 minutes. For vertical stabilizer, we can use clip clamps to squeeze it together and then apply some extra thin. For any awkward areas that are tough to clamp, we can add some blue tack to the pads, which will help it grip to the part. Once the two halves are firmly glued together, we can move on to step 17 and add the fuel tank cover. When cutting out this part, take extra care to make sure it's trimmed and cleaned up well. This fit may cause some issues. Airfix Spitfires are renowned for having a slight gap here. When you're presented with a gap or the option of essentially choosing where the gap is, in this case the part slides forward or back, so you could have the gap at the front or the back. Think about what would be easier to fill and sand. In this situation, I'm going to push the part to the front and have the gap just below the canopy. It's the smallest area and a relatively flat surface to fill, making it a bit easier to deal with. Don't forget to paint the gun sight mount before gluing this part on. Here I've just used some Vallejo acrylic black and applied it with a brush directly to the plastic. Put the part where you want it and apply some extra thin to the joint. And that completes the fuselage assembly for now. Let's move on to the wings, starting with the ordnance selection. This is entirely optional, and to fit the rockets or bombs you'll need to drill some holes for the locating pins. I was unsure if I was going to add rockets, but I drilled the holes anyway for a demonstration. The instructions will give you the size of the drill bit required, and you can find packs of drill bits in a range of sizes on places like Amazon. These aren't specific for model making, but they come in the right range, 0.2mm to 1mm. It's up to you whether to drill the parts out on or off the sprue. For me, I like to take the part off as it gives me better flexibility on how I can hold it. Remember to use the techniques you've learnt so far when removing the wing. It's just as important as the fuselage, so take care when cleaning it up. On the inside of the wings, there are markers for where to drill. These markers are the correct size, so if your drill bit's too big to fit in the indent, it's a sign that you need to use a smaller drill bit, or vice versa. If you don't get this right, the locating pin won't fit properly in the end. If you drill a hole too small, it's not so much of an issue as you can widen it at the end, but try and get this right. As with all things, it's better to measure twice and cut once. After drilling, you'll get some plastic on the exit hole. This can be easily scraped off with a knife, and you can also use the drill to go back through from the opposite direction to further clean it up. Moving on to step 19, we start to assemble the landing gear bays and some internal structure for the wings. Because the design is quite simple and there isn't much intricate detail, I would approach this by gluing all the parts together and then paint them all as one. So go ahead and complete steps 19 and 20 and cut out the upper wing parts, as they also need to be painted. You may need to clamp the parts in step 20, as I've done. Note that there is a smaller clear part that gets added at this stage too. I would put this part in after painting to protect it, but it's up to you and your confidence with the airbrush. Moving on to painting the gear bay, we can see the areas that are going to be visible and we can focus on just painting those. The instructions tell us that for scheme A it's the same colour as the underside, so if you wanted to, you could skip this painting and do it at the same time as the main paint scheme. But I'm going to spend some time on this and do some specific weathering whilst it's still open and easy to access. So we're going to use MRP 112 Medium Sea Grey. Applying it in the same way we did in the previous episode. 15 to 20 psi light coats from the bottle straight onto the plastic. When painting the tight confined areas, make sure you apply it in light coats, as even a small amount of paint will build up quickly here. Once you've got a nice even colour, we need to do the same as we did with the cockpit and seal the paint in with a varnish layer before we can start weathering. I'll be using X22 again, mixing at a ratio of 1:3 with X20A. 2 light coats is plenty, leaving around 10 minutes for drying between them. Leave the varnish to dry for around an hour or blast it with a hairdryer. Now, using a wash of your choice, I'm using the same as the cockpit, apply it to the raised details until you've got the whole area looking dirty. You can do this as much or as little as you want. Once it's dry, wipe away the excess using cotton buds and you'll be left with a wash only in the corners and the edges. Now you can seal it in with a varnish of your choice. For this area, I simply left it as is. I'll probably come back later on and add more weathering, so I wanted to maintain the gloss varnish layer. Moving on to part 21, we start to join the wings to the fuselage. The lower wing section slots in nicely with the fuselage. Again, we can work in stages and start by gluing the back and then moving to the front. Make sure all the joints are free from excess sprue, cleaned up and ready to be glued. I use Tamiya cement for the undercarriage blocks, as it needs to be a firm connection and it's locked in by the wings, so we don't have to worry about it shifting out of place. Now I'll line up the rear part and use quick set to fuse it in place until I no longer need to apply pressure. You could use quick set along the whole area, as it will dry quicker and it will make life easier. However, make sure you apply it quickly and don't spend too long on the same spot, as it will start to eat away at the plastic. Once that's firm, we can use the finger clamp to hold it in place. We can also use the clips to hold the outer section, making sure not to get any glue on the clamps. Next, we can seal up the front using the finger clamps to hold it. This is a fiddly process and will require some perseverance, but keep working at it until the gaps are closed and everything is glued firmly. After a few minutes, you can remove the clamps and start preparing the upper wing sections to be added. Make sure the wing root edge is smooth and flat with no excess sprue. It needs to butt up flush with the fuselage part. You can dry fit until you achieve a good seal. In some cases, you may not be able to achieve this, but try to get the least gap possible, and whatever's left we will fill in the next chapter. On the inside of the wings, you might need to sand down the ejector pin marks, as these might be stopping you from properly closing the wing halves. Now, with your clamps at the ready, apply a light layer of Tamiya cement to the flat areas of the inside of the wings. Then carefully place them together. You have a few seconds to maneuver the parts before they start to harden. Place the clamps near the edges, as this is where the main connections are. shift them around to areas that need more pressure to close the gaps. There's nothing wrong with covering the wings in clamps if you have the numbers. Additionally, you can go around the joint with extra thin cement to further fuse the parts. As you can see, in the process of aligning the wings correctly, we're left with a gap at both wing roots. The right side is significantly larger than the left. This is quite a common thing with aircraft kits, but also quite straightforward to fix. I'll cover this in the next chapter. Remove the clamps after a few minutes and you'll be left with a lump of plastic resembling an airplane. Now we need to add all the small extras to make it look like a Spitfire. Starting with the rear stabilizers. The horizontal stabilizers come in two halves with a locating tab at the end. Glue these however you see fit. Using a clamp might be helpful here too. Check that the alignment is correct by looking down the edge and see if one side is overlapping the other. When adding the horizontal stabilizers, make sure that you follow the instructions to achieve the 90-degree angle. You can use a square edge to check this or just do it by eye. Another trick is to use the elevator part as a jig. The elevator comes as one solid piece, which makes life easier and also allows us to pose it. I'm going to have mine pointed down as this is accurate to how the aircraft would be sitting on the ground. Gluing the elevator in place is a bit tricky as there's no tab or locating pins, so you may need to hold it in place until the glue goes off. If you're having it level, then you can just use a clamp. But for angled poses, you'll need to come up with a different solution, or just do what I did and hold it with your fingers. Using extra thin quickset will be a good idea. Once that's firm, we can slot in the small square piece that encloses the elevator rod. This was quite tight and I had to do a bit of trimming to get mine to fit, but careful working of the knife did the trick. Once that's in, you can go back and add more glue to the joint if you need to. Now for the rudder. This is quite simple, with one piece it goes straight on. You can pose the rudder as you like, but note that on the real aircraft the rudder and the tail wheel are connected, so however you pose the rudder you'll need to do the same with the tail wheel. For the ailerons it's as simple as cut out, clean up and place them in. Do your best to have them sit flush with the underside and the curved wing edge. Now for the air intake under the nose. It comes as two halves, which means we'll be left with a centre seam line. Sometimes it's best to fix the seams on parts like this before putting them on the model, but in this case we can see that we still have good accessibility even after it's added on. So go ahead and put it in place. A point to note is I leave the excess sprue on instead of cutting them flush. This means we can file it off when it's assembled and we don't get left with a dent after cutting it flat. It's hard to explain, but it's best to test it out and see for yourself. For the radiator coolers, we need to paint the inside grey, but the grills need to be black. So cut the parts off and add the flaps in open or closed, but leave the grills separate. I've gone for closed as it's more simple. Now we'll start with the grey. I'm temporarily covering up the wheel well from overspray with Tamiya masking tape. The instructions tell us that they're painted the same grey as the underside, so we'll use MRP 112, spraying directly onto the plastic. Paint both the inside of the intakes and the wings. This won't be very visible at the end, so one coat is plenty. Now onto the black for the grills, using MRP 005 again directly onto the plastic. The grills only need to be painted on the textured face. Also, avoiding the sides will stop the paint from affecting their fit. Once they're painted black, we can use the dry brushing technique to give them a little bit of life and bring out the textured grille. I'm using the same brush and paint as we did on the cockpit. Simply put the paint on the brush, wipe it off, then lightly pass the brush over the part and the silver paint will be left on the raised areas, highlighting the details. At this point, you could also add a wash or any other weathering techniques you'd like. Once it's painted, we can assemble the parts. The grills need to be fully seated into the housing to make sure that it sits flush underneath the wing. You may need to apply a lot of pressure to get them in. If you still can't, just sand or scrape away at the edges to make them slightly smaller. Also, you may need to sand off the edges of the housing to get it into the recess. Remember that they are specifically left and right, so if they aren't fitting well, just check that they're the right way round. Tamiya Extra Thin or Quickset is perfect to glue these in place. Moving on to step 35, we're adding the two panels to the rear of the fuselage. In some versions of the Spitfire, this is where the reconnaissance cameras were fitted, but not for the Mark 18, so we're covering them up. Making sure the two panels are cut out and trimmed precisely is key to getting a good fit. They're also left and right specific, so don't get caught out. Drop them in place and make sure they're centered before gluing them. Don't press them in whilst gluing, as they may go in too deep. Once the plastic has glue on it, it becomes soft as it fuses together, so for parts like this you may end up bending or moving the melted plastic out of where it should be, so be cautious and trust the engineering of the kit. Now use the same techniques for the cowling bulges over the engine. These were added to Spitfires to fit the larger Griffin engine. For the guns, the fit is really not great, but focus on getting them centered and level from above and to the side. We want these to be glued on straight, but the pin won't do that for you, so you'll need to spend some time whilst the glue hardens, making sure they stay in the right place. Lastly, we're going to cut out and prep all the remaining parts, mainly the undercarriage. By now you should be a pro at cutting out and cleaning up parts, so I'll skip to the gluing bit. You can add the torque links for the gear legs by using Tamiya cement on the pins, or carefully put it in place and dab on some extra thin or Quickset. Both ways will work fine. Looking at the wheels, we can see that the sprue has been added onto the tread, so trim it down with a blade or cutters and then use a sanding sponge to begin to work down the excess, trying not to take away the track texture. We don't want to sand down the detail, as this would be very challenging to repair. A bit of patience will go a long way. Luckily, Airfix has moulded the wheels as one piece, so we don't have to worry about any seam lines. Now finish with the exhaust, and that wraps up the airframe construction. You should be left with a lump of plastic resembling a Spitfire.